Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
One of the things that really I find so interesting about reading these texts is that we can bring ourselves to the text. Now, I'm someone I've taken the biblical studies courses kind of at the undergrad level and at the graduate level. And so I realize that there are ways in which a lot of what I'm saying maybe might not, pass muster at an academic level, because then it's possible to read what I'm saying as like, oh, this is actually maybe like some critical race theory, or it's overly personal. You're performing eisegesis, like you're reading yourself into the text rather than exegesis, getting something from the text. And so I know that sometimes that kind of reading makes people feel very uncomfortable, and might make the text feel more partisan than it need be. And I just want to say I'm really sensitive to that as well, and I understand that perspective. The one thing that I would say, though, is that all of our communities, from the someone like me carrying this Jew of color experience, studying to be a rabbi, to the academic experience, to a parent going about their day, we're all bringing ourselves to the text, and we're bringing a set of assumptions, a set of tools to the text. So whereas some folks might not be able to see the lens of race or Jews of color as having, a significant and substantial value, I would say, in as much as is possible, open yourself up to the possibilities of it, because I'm not the only Jew of color who is looking at this story in some of the ways that I've described. There are others who are seeing it similarly and seeing it differently. So in as much as a person can open themselves up to the possibility and to that kind of shachavatariya, that give and take of how it is we Jews engage with scripture, I actually think that there's something beneficial that can be gained from it. And what's more is that I think that it can actually be it can strengthen community, and strengthen ties between folks who might feel marginal in Jewish communities, with kind of, those broader communities that are maybe more at the center. One of the best things we could do, while also maintaining a healthy, respect for Jewish text, is also just reading it from a very human lens. Like, I think about kind of in the way that I thought about Abraham and Isaac. Like, I have made sacrifices, and possibly even sacrificed relationships, much in the way that Abraham did. And I have felt myself being offered as a sacrifice, or being othered. And that is something that I'm not sure, if I took the text a little too much like history playing out, I'm not sure that I would have the mental flexibility to be able to recognize myself in the text. Maybe I would, but I think that the text is the text is capacious, and it's far greater than we often give it credit. I mean, it's one of the most brilliant pieces of literature ever written. Honestly, I really feel that way. I've encountered the Akedah in a couple of different ways throughout my life. Growing up, I grew up right outside of Dallas, Texas, in a large Black megachurch. So I grew up Christian, and there was a certain way of reading the text in that context. So looking at Genesis 22, the emphasis that I grew up with was this was such an act of faith and a great sacrifice that Abraham did in order to be willing to sacrifice Isaac to God. And what's more, we really focused on this notion of I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants. So in the church that I grew up in, this was very much seen kind of as a blessing for church folk and a kind of prefiguration of the sacrifice that Jesus made by dying on the cross. So that's kind of how I grew up thinking about the story and reading the story. And then in college, through a series of decisions that I'm still trying to process to this day, I became interested in Judaism. I decided that, okay, I want to study for conversion, and that process started in my second year of college. And in choosing to become chosen, I also had to learn there's a different way to read the text other than how I grew up with it. So we paid a lot of attention to the actual words in the Hebrew. And I found that in studying with the rabbi at my college, that you could actually make a whole world out of just reading a couple of words in Hebrew. So that was a very new way of reading for me, like to get into the very details, very atomistic, so to speak. And so one new way that I had to learn how to read was by doing that. But then I also had this struggle inside of me. Okay, there's this new way of reading the text, but also where am I in the text? I come with this experience being a Black American who is the grandchild and great grandchild of many preachers. Like, it's not a background that I want to get rid of. Rather, I want to find some way that it complements my being Jewish. So, one example of a new way that I learned to read the text that kind of brought together that, really looking closely at what's happening in the Hebrew and my background is actually in verse 5 of Genesis 22, where we see it says, then Abraham said to his servants, and when it says servants, it's na'arav. And he said, you stay here with the ass, and the boy and I will go up there. And when it says the boy and I, it says, ba'ani ve'hana'av nelcha atko. So we will go up there, and we will worship, and we will return to you. Now, this is kind of the introduction in the story right before Abraham and Isaac go up, and Abraham will attempt to sacrifice him. So growing up, I just kind of read it very simply, okay, that's because I didn't have any access to the Hebrew. But now when I look at it, now that I have some access, I think it's so interesting that Abraham said to his servants, Na'arav, you stay here with the ass, and the boy and I, ani ve'hana'av, will go up there. So he uses the same word for his servants as he does for Isaac. So I started asking myself in kind of the more traditional Jewish manner, what's going on with this epithet? Why does he not use the name Isaac? And I'm sure that, the Mefarshim, the interpreters, do plenty with that. But for me, as a Black person living in America who's inside of Jewish communities, I think that there's another way that I can also read it. And for me, it's like when I step into a new Jewish space, I took the time and did the study to convert. So I am very much part of the Jewish narrative. And yet, in stepping into certain Jewish spaces, people speak to me as if I don't belong. They might say, oh, are you lost? Do you work as part of the custodial staff? Or in some cases where they're just really eager and excited, they might ask me, what's your story, before they even ask me what my name is. But in all of those cases, they're not acknowledging me as part of their story. So kind of in the way that Abraham calls Isaac Hana'av, kind of identifying him with these servants who are kind of outside of the story, these Na'arav. It's kind of a similar experience that I go through when I walk into certain Jewish spaces. So that's kind of one example of a new way that I learned to read the story that brings together both my love and commitment to Jewish text and to Jewish study, while also seeing myself and seeing the stories of folks like myself inside of the text. I read this use, Abraham's use of Hana'ar, as a way of distancing himself from Isaac relationally. because we see even earlier in the text that when the divine is talking to Abraham, we actually get very specific uh, in like your son, your only son, your chosen son, Isaac. So it's like it's almost like a camera is just like zooming in order to make it very clear who we're talking about. And so Abraham does the exact opposite in distancing himself, maybe in order to lessen the pain of the situation. But I I think that much in the way that Abraham kind of uses this language to keep a certain distance, um, certain assumptions that are made about me when I step into Jewish space also create a certain distance. So it doesn't matter if I'm wearing a kippah, I can still step into a space and the language or the first questions that I experience kind of have me at, keep me at, an arm's length. And that can be really challenging for someone to view you or to view me as I am viewed as a na'ar or something or someone who works there when with my kippah it would imply something different. Like, sure, the world might know me as Kendell Pinkney, but the divine knows me by the name Hillel Ovadia ben Abraham Visara. So I'm more than Hana'ar. I'm actually, I'm very much a protagonist in this Jewish story. The process of going through this binding and this almost sacrifice is really, really heavy. And the consequences of it, I think, can be seen in what follows. Because inside of the text, um, after this moment, it almost seems like a lot of things inside of the family, of the immediate family of Abraham, kind of like things start to fall apart. So Abraham and Isaac seemingly don't really speak to each other after this, and um, we also get the death of Sarah that comes, not too far after this, and so it really does lead one to wonder um, this kind of sacrifice that displayed so much fidelity, and so much trust in God. What exactly was lost in this? And when I kind of think about it and try to find myself in this text and tie it back to my experience stepping into Jewish spaces, there is a kind of there is a kind of pain that comes from these moments of being othered inside of space. Uh, I chose to become Jewish. So I chose to be part of the narrative and to partake in the narrative of the Jewish peoples. So stepping into certain spaces where it seems that people are willing to other me or kind of use me as like a kind of sacrifice. Um, the amount of times that that happens, it feels like it could push me away, and it actually really strains the relationship in certain cases with certain Jewish communities. Now, I know the difference between someone being having really great intentions when they're asking a question and someone not having great intentions, but regardless of what the intention is, the impact of language that others where I am considered, hana'ar, a servant or the young man or the boy, even depending on how we want to translate that, um, as opposed to being viewed as Jewish, um, it, it takes a toll. And whereas I'm a rabbinical student, so I've committed myself to sticking with the process and staying in community and working through that. But I have so many friends who are Jews of color who one situation around their B'nai Mitzvah, and it's like, okay, I'm done. I've been othered enough. So the ramifications can be quite serious. I think that with this story, almost everyone has to ask themselves the question, who am I in this story? And when am I that character in the story? At what points am I Isaac? Am I, in essence, a sacrifice? Am I someone being, offered to the divine because of a commandment, and in what cases am I Abraham? Um, I definitely see in the story of Abraham, there is a calling to go forth from your native land and to follow the decree of, the divine. And I would say that for many Jews who have chosen to be Jewish, like myself, there definitely is that sense of calling, which is, it's a weird word to use because I think, at least for me, I associate that kind of with my Christian background, where a lot of people choose to become Christian and then they say, I had a call to something. But we do see that Abraham is also called and compelled to choose to go along a certain path. So there are definitely moments that I have felt myself to be in a version of Abraham in this story. I'm called, and I'm called to be Jewish, and in choosing that, there are certain sacrifices that I make. For example, so to leave your homeland, I don't go back to Texas all that often, and that's so that's kind of like one sacrifice. But then, kind of in the more personal way, I think about, my parents' home. My parents are still in a pretty they have a serious Christian home, and they attend church as often as possible, often 2 to 3 times a week. So there is a kind of sacrifice and a kind of loss, and I would even say kind of a cultural sacrifice, because for 18, 19, 20 years, I was part of that. And there's a certain warmth and love I have for the Black church that I can't access in the same way. Um, that being said, one of the beautiful things about um, one of the beautiful things about our current times is that it seems like there often is space to exist in your many identities. So there are times when I get to exist as a Jew of color in Jew of color spaces. There are times when I get to exist as a person of color in person of color spaces, or even more specifically for me, in like person of color Christian spaces. Like there's a comfortability with that, an ability to code switch, while still remaining very much centered in my Jewish identity. And there are ways to stand fully in my Jewish identity and practice as well. So there are some people who might look at that and say, oh, well, where does the integration come in? There are certainly times that it feels super integrated, but I would also argue that we are all made up of so many different concerns and parts. And whether we choose to acknowledge them or not, they're there. And it can be really wonderful and edifying to give space for these different parts of ourselves to express themselves. And then whenever you're like really in deep relationship with people, find ways to share them, even with those who don't necessarily have access to those other parts, because it's not one of their communities.